You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. It's our second show of 2025. It's Wednesday, January 15th. And I want to give a big shout out and thank you to Heritage Radio Network. It's our 16th year. Support us, become a member at heritageradionetwork.org. So back in April of 2023, I met with author and publisher Carlo DeVito, and we did a great podcast called 400 Years of Serious Drinking. And I got a little bit of the layout of the book that Carlo's been working on with many other beer writers and researchers. It's going to be called Empire. It might come out in the next year or so. And we wanted to catch up because there's so many interesting topics that I even had to ask Carlo, what topic should we talk about today? So we're going to go around the room and we're going to talk about a couple topics that are of interest to the history of beer in New York that will be in the book Empire. So, Don and Carlo, you guys each in turn introduce yourselves briefly.
Yeah, I'm Carlo DeVito, and I'm a publisher, editor, writer, author, and winemaker, and I'm the general editor and contributor of this book called Empire Beer, New York's Brewing History from 1613 to present.
Great. And you brought a friend along.
I brought a friend along. This is Don. Don, introduce yourself.
All right. Don Kazant. I'm a writer, reporter at Syracuse.com and our affiliate NewYorkUpstate.com. And I mostly cover food and beverages and a lot of, the distilleries, breweries, wineries, and all that kind of stuff. And I've been doing that about 30 years, back in the early days of what is now called craft, before it was called craft.
I just want to mention at the outset that the other two writers who can't join us today are Alan McLeod and Craig Gravina. So this is a large group of people. These are all beer historians, New York State beer historians, who've come together to work on this project. It's like 3.5 years right now at this point.
So Carlo, I know you were posting about it a lot. I saw a lot of questions. You even said that you were pulling some ideas from old Beer Sessions radio episodes, and thanks for including me. So let's just dive in. So Carlo, I asked you about a couple topics, and you gave me a short list. You remember the short list of topics you gave me?
Oh yeah, I think the overall arching topic is really supply chain, and that really stretches out from the original sort of foraging and then farm brewing that dates back to the Dutch colonial period, all the way to industrial brewing in the not in the 20th century, and then the birth of craft in the late 20th and 21st century. So, and that encapsulates conversations about transportation and innovation, and it's really a fascinating kind of tour.
So let's start with it. Get a subtopic. I mean, we mentioned industrialization. That's really big, but new equipment, thermometers, steam engines. I know a little bit about how industrialization impacted beer. Let's start there. Don, you jump in on where you feel comfortable.
Yeah, well, when you talk about supply chain and then you move into transportation, I think when you're talking go back in the history of New York State, the big elephant in the room is the Erie Canal. And your timing is great because 2025 happens to be the bicentennial year of the completion of the Erie Canal, the wetting of the waters, bringing Lake Erie and New York Harbor together. I don't think we can underestimate that particular moment in the growth of New York beer, because that allowed raw supplies to go in one direction and finished product to go in another direction. And I think if I was going to try to pinpoint the single biggest thing in that era, that the completion of the canal would have to be it.
Absolutely. The canal is key to everything. You have to remember that before the canal, if you were growing grain either in the Hudson Valley or in the Finger Lakes, now the Finger Lakes up until about 1890 were the largest growers of barley and hops in all of the United States. And to get your goods to market before the Erie Canal, you were doing it by a wagon, and you were taking maybe a ton and a half is most of what a wagon could take down to a brewery. It was really hard. The transportation made it almost impossible for that to happen. And so, with the birth of the Erie Canal, instead of dragging 3,000 pounds, across wilderness trails, you could now move 10,000 pounds on a barge through the canal system. And this allows places like Albany, Poughkeepsie, Buffalo, and New York a massive advantage in terms of they've got a thirsty population, and now they can start to get some of the grain and hops that they need to grow their businesses. And what the impressive thing is, if you're living in that age, is that throughout the colonial period, if even if you were an urban brewery, you were only in the Wall Street area, more or less, and so the breweries had farms just up north where Chelsea was one of the largest farm estates in the entire island, and
Amazing.
that was owned by Clement Seymour, actually, the guy who wrote was the
Night
night
before
before
Christmas.
Christmas. So the supply chain was very short, and it varied. When the colonial Dutch were here, first they foraged. They used whatever grasses they could find. They found honey, and they were making a beer just out of anything they could because the original brewers were stranded here, the sailors, and they had to have beer. So but as you get further along, the Dutch drank a lot of wheat beer, so they grew wheat. And when the British take over, they use barley, and it takes almost 50 years for us to get a barley that grows in New York State in a substantial way that it can become a reliable commercial crop. And that allows brewing to make a huge leap. And that happens originally in the Hudson Valley in the 1700s. And by the late 1700s, early 1800s, there's no drinkable water in lower Manhattan. And so the first person to take advantage of this opportunity was a guy named Matthew Vassar. You may have heard of Vassar College, for example. And he becomes the first millionaire brewer. He uses the steamships of the period to move his product up and down the waterway, and that's the first part of transportation that really makes a huge difference. We can now move barges of grain up and down the Hudson River. Makes a huge difference in what you can accomplish as a brewer. You're going from small quantities to larger quantities, and then, as Don points out, with the birth of the Erie Canal, you're talking, okay, now the supply chain actually moves. The Hudson Valley no longer dominates the agricultural landscape for grain, and all of that moves out to the Finger Lakes where Don lives. And that's what you're talking about. Now we've got an extended supply chain. That's the beginning of industrialization right there.
And I want to point out too, Carlos talked a lot about grain and barley and hops and all those other ingredients, but let's remember that the number one ingredient in beer is water. And when you move, as Carlos said, when you move up to this beautiful area that I live in, upstate New York, we are blessed. Well, we're blessed with a lot of things, including snow. We're blessed with a lot of fresh water. I mean, we have Lake Erie, we have Lake Ontario, we have the Finger Lakes, we have lakes. They call Minnesota the land of 10,000 lakes. I bet New Upstate New York can almost do that. Uh, so as breweries start uh, opening up west of the Hudson Valley, um, they're blessed with the fact that the water supply, good clean water supply, abundant water supply, is right here, right in their backyard. Everywhere you look in upstate New York.
Yeah, and New York, even though it has the largest audience, up until the 1850s, and then just after the Civil War, does not have a reliable and plentiful enough water system. The original water, fresh water in New York, in the lower part of Manhattan, was the collecting pond, and that got ruined by a brewery called the Old Brewery, which is what it became known as. And you probably have seen it if you've watched Gangs of New York. That's the actual brewery that went out of business, but helped ruin the collecting pond along with a tannery and a couple of other businesses. And so that's when they had to create the Croton Aqueduct, which was a nice first attempt, but it did not solve the water issues of the city. And it's not until the second aqueduct is finished, or after the Civil War, and that drilling on the island and in Brooklyn starts to happen, that allow for enough fresh water to start brewing beer down in the city. So you get Albany, and you get a number of breweries along the canal that become very successful. Albany and Troy become a massive hub of brewing in the early 1800s and after the Civil War.
So where was Vassar beer?
Vassar was in Poughkeepsie, and so he was close enough to the city given the transportation that he did. But he lived a very long life, and eventually he bought into the railroads, and the railroads made his life even easier and made everybody's lives easier. And that's how he was able to really compound his fortune, and so that's he owned both the railways and the largest brewery. So he was making money hand over fist.
His name lived on into the craft beer era because there was a big beer fest. It's still around, but it was really big a while ago, called Tap New York, and it had a big prize every year. The biggest prize awarded at Tap New York every year was called the Vassar Cup. So people remember who he is even today.
Wow. So back to Vassar. So in that time, what era was Vassar brewing, and what were the beers like then?
His was a very highly hopped beer, and matter of fact, it was Craig Gravina and Alan McLeod who helped discover the original brewing logs and recipes for Matthew Vassar's ales. And they were very, very, very hoppy, very much like what we would see as a triple hopped beer today. And that was the style he sold that traveled well because the hops kept the beer fresh and acted as a preservative and allowed him to ship his beers a long distance. So, matter of fact, at Vassar, they had a whole bunch of students who actually recreated the beer. And the recipe lives on today. And I know Craig was very heavily involved in that.
That's great. Don, do you want to say anything else about the Vassar beer? Or what era was it? Let's talk about the beers of those styles and just see how they evolved too.
Well, again, beer. I don't want to step on Don, so I apologize. But beer in the
That's okay.
beginning in New York State varied greatly because it depended upon who was running the place. So when the Dutch were here, they drank a lot of Dutch style beers. So you were drinking a lot of wheat beers and Belgian style beers, that kind of thing. That was what was going on. Then when the British come over, they want the beers of their homeland. And with each successive wave of immigration, each group brings over their beers that they want to drink, their styles that are accustomed in their own home countries. And that's really the story of brewing in New York State. And it culminates with the heavy influx of Germans just before the Civil War and just after the Civil War that bring the Pilsner to the fore.
Even in a small city like Syracuse, we had, if you go back to the 1800s, we had German breweries, English breweries, and even a couple of Irish breweries, depending on where the owners had come from. To Carlo's point about the Pilsner, the lager, the Germans, I love this. I've seen a lot of writing about this in the mid 1800s. There was a lot of worry back then about what we now would call temperance. Men were drinking too much, and that was getting out of hand. And I love the fact that in the mid 1800s they really welcomed the German style lagers because they thought they were lighter and therefore less likely to make men drunk and unable to work. So all the temperance people were like, yay lager, that's what we want.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. But, in New York City, a melting pot, the original beer gardens really came under a lot of pressure. Again, if you've seen Gangs of New York, there were the Know Nothings, which were led by Bill the Butcher. And Bill the Butcher was very much against beer gardens because, again, it was just the infiltration of the rabble of Europe taking up room for that should belong to quote unquote natives who were born here a generation earlier. So it was it was really politically charged in the beginning, but later on, as Don points out, uh, lager was embraced.
It's great. So let's keep going through the history. But back to Vassar. What era was Vassar brewing at
You're
its
talking
start?
about the 1800s, early 1800s to just after the Civil War. He helped build what is now the Hudson River line, and he wanted the train to come all the way up to Poughkeepsie, and then he realized, no, I need this to go further so I can sell some beer north of the city as well. So he became an incredibly wealthy man. He was a very smart businessman and owned a number of different businesses, but it all stemmed from the brewery.
Carlo, am I wrong that he involved in some way in the creation of some of the reservoirs up in the Catskills?
I didn't get a chance to look into that because we're so pressed for space in the book as it is.
Yeah, yeah.
But he was so involved in so much that went on in the Hudson Valley. He and the Livingstons basically ran the Hudson Valley for, I don't know, a good 50 years jointly.
So I'm going to go back to the book because I got Carla going through the book. I mean, it's just jam packed, right? I mean, you've got 400 years and how many pages?
Well, that's our biggest problem right now. Our original research paper came down to about 350,000 words, which is basically an 800-page book, which was not publishable. But uh, all of us were like, "Oh, but there's so much good information in there." But at one point or another, you have to cut. So we've gone through a lot of cutting, trying to condense this down to a book that people will actually read. It's still going to be a good 400 to 500 page book. It's a big history because, for example, I think the important thing to understand is that the supply chain, as much as the canal, and like most people, the most I remember about the Erie Canal is that there was a mule and her name was Sal, and the canal was 15 miles as far as I could remember. And you really begin to understand the value of the canal. Number one, you could move 10 times the amount of weight through the canal and down the Hudson River. And number two, what used to take, if you were trying to bring grain from Buffalo to, say, New York City, which was all but impossible, you could now, Vassar took advantage of the canal because now you could get it was like the FedEx of the day. You could get those grades, you could order them, and you'd get those grains in 10, 11 days. So it made a massive change. And then what happens is that the canal starts to become obsolete as the railroads begin to take hold. And the railroads push the canal. And of course, as in any business thing, what happened was a lot of the smaller railroads bought up a lot of the ancillary canals from the Erie Canal and shut them down and put them out of business. And eventually the canal became somewhat obsolete. And the other thing that happened was that cheap land and cheap labor were available out west. And we had a series of blights and bad weather. And so the hops and the grain moved. California became the number one producer of barley, and Washington and Oregon took over the hops industry. So by 1900, we had been the number one producer of hops and barley, and that all goes away by 1900. But we're getting larger amounts of grain from the Midwest. Buffalo becomes the number one grain capital of the world in just after the invention of the Dart grain elevator. And Buffalo was the number one mover of grain from about 1850 to 1950. And it's that's a huge thing because now, with the railroad, coupled with the railroad, they can get even more grain to breweries faster than ever before. So now you see, we went from foraging and making beer on the island to sourcing it from the Hudson Valley to sourcing it from the Finger Lakes to ultimately moving it from Canada and the Midwest and California all the way down to, for example, Manhattan, where you had six of the largest breweries in America.
So sometimes back to beer and beer in the city, you're saying that with the technology, the production, which was the breweries, were able to be located where there were the masses of people.
Yeah, I mean that was always New York's real calling card. Was that in New York, all major cities. Usually, you had a brewery inside a major city. That's why you had, like, for example, Buffalo had Gerhard Lang's, and you had in Rochester you had a number of really big breweries. Albany had one brewery, Fitzgerald, that was 2 city blocks long, and in Troy, New York. I mean, it was massive. So wherever you had people, it was easier to make the beer and sell it to them there than it was to transport it. The refrigeration still hadn't taken place yet in a large way. So urban breweries became the sort of order of the day. Don, I'm sure you have more to say about that.
Well, yeah, I was going to add on to your thing about Buffalo. Even today, if you go down to Buffalo, the south end of Buffalo, you got those big grain elevators. Just all the heyday of when Buffalo was the grain capital of the world, as Carlos said. He also alluded to, and I wanted to make sure people understand when it comes to hops. We think of now hops being grown in like Oregon and Washington, but there was a time before that, in the Mohawk Valley, particularly around Cooperstown and that area, believe it or not, that was the hop capital of the whole United States back in the 1800s. Unfortunately, a blight took care of that. But if you're ever visiting the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, you're in historic hop country right there. So I just wanted to make sure we knew about that.
Don, I've been a few times when I visited Omegang Brewery in Cooperstown. I've been to the Farm Museum, and I know they still have a hop yard and a historic hop house.
Yep, Omegang was built on a historic hop field. That's what that land had been back in the day. So, but yeah, as Carlos said about the urban breweries too, even in Syracuse, which again is not the biggest city in the world, but we had a brewery. One of the big breweries was called Greenways, and it occupied 2 city blocks. It was right on the canal, and I think back in the day they were actually shipping beer as far as China from Syracuse, New York,
Yeah.
which is really remarkable to believe.
And then, Don, just as I have you, what were the styles of Greenway beer? What were people drinking in Syracuse? You mentioned
Greenway was one of the. I mentioned it. He was an Englishman. Jay, I think I forget his first name, but he definitely made what would be what you'd call an English style ale. Probably as with all beers, early 1800s, it would have been a darker ale and probably lightened up. as time went on. Whether they called it a pale ale or not, over time, as technology improved as far as being able to kiln the barley to exact measurements, they could start lightening up the beer. But it would a lot of Greenways was primarily an ale brewery. I believe by the 1890s they were making something they called an IPA, an India Pale Ale, which we would probably not recognize today as an India Pale Ale, but they were certainly using those terms.
So again, Dawn, so Syracuse, Greenway, what systems were they using to brew then?
That's a really good question. And Carlo can help me with this. Most brewers, many brewers were immigrants that came from whichever country they came from. They were probably bringing over the systems they used. So the English systems, the English immigrants were using English systems. The Germans were bringing over what is it called, decoction and stuff like that, and lagering. So I think originally the brewers were using what they knew, and then being American immigrants, they probably started adapting to what else they could find and what their neighbors were doing.
Yeah, what happened was that most of them used wooden vessels and eventually started using metal pipes. But the problem was that if you got an infection of any kind of bacteria in your system, you'd basically have to scrap the system. It was almost virtually impossible to get that bacteria out once it was ingrained in the wood, if you'll forgive the pun. And so what happened was in the late 1800s, one of the most important innovations in brewing, and perhaps it's an amazing story. There were two brothers. Their name were Fowler, P.F. Lauder, or something like that. Pfaudler, something like that. Anyway,
Audler,
so
yep.
they invent a glass lined system. And so the glass, for example, you've heard the story, the old advertising from Rolling Rock, the glass lined tanks of
Yeah.
Latrobe. The Fowlers invented that, and every major brewery in New York State, including today, Saranac still has Fowler tanks. And I believe Saranac does too. I may be wrong on that, but I believe they do. And I
I
know
think they do. I think they do. Yep.
and I know some of the Budweiser plant has them. Fowler eventually became a multi-billion-dollar multinational company. The systems that they used for beer eventually were used for dairy and eventually used for a number of different fruit processing, and then later became very invaluable in the atomic energy business. So they are a massive, massive company, but they made a huge difference in being able to maintain the quality of beer because the bacteria couldn't hold on to the glass the way it could wood. And so you could run some cleaning solvents, things like citric acid or tartaric acid, sulfites through your system to wash it out. It would be clean, and then you could brew again without having fear of an infection of bacteria. So that was a huge and monumental change in the brewing business that affected the world brewing business, not just New York, but New York took advantage of it because we were right here.
I just want to pipe in with another interesting modern thing. Upstate New York in recent years has become one of the Greek yogurt capitals of the world, and they use a similar technology for companies like Chobani, which is based upstate. I don't know if they use Fowler systems, but they use that concept in making their products as well.
But that's really interesting about the systems. So then also, I'm only going to ask about Syracuse, Don, because you mentioned it. Service, and were people drinking in pubs? Were they drinking beer gardens? How did they drink their beer? Was it dispensed from wooden casks? What were the systems that were being used?
Yeah, the systems I'm not so sure about. I'm very familiar with the whole idea of the beer gardens in New York City and Manhattan and Queens and everything. I think there were some of that in Syracuse. I don't think it was as big a cultural thing in Syracuse in particular as it would have been in a place like New York City, the beer garden culture. Um, but in Syracuse, the north side of the city was where the German breweries were and the German population. So I imagine, in the well, let's point out at Syracuse in the uh, 2 months out of the year when it doesn't snow up here, they might have had some beer gardens.
So Greenway, would I go to a bar and would I get a growler? I mean, how would I get my beer?
Yeah, I mean,
You would get a
it was remember
pail. You would get a pail. You wouldn't get a
a
growler.
pail,
You'd
yeah,
get a
the
pail.
old the old yeah the old bucket of suds.
Exactly.
You get that from any brewery. That was the original growler because as I understand it, as the kids were, and it was always kids who were delivering them, were running through the streets with these things. They would shake the beer up, and the beer would be making these gurgling noises, and that's where a growler came
The
from.
lid would, yeah, you'd
Yeah,
hear the fizzing coming through the lid. Yeah, yeah. It was. There are so many stories, yeah, across the country of kids running to get their parents' beer, or kids would buy beer and then sell it to men coming out of the factories. Who to single men who just wanted to have a bucket of suds for themselves. But really important note about serving beer before Prohibition. There were restaurants and bars that were independent, but in the main, most of the saloons that sold beer were actually owned. The license was actually owned by the brewery. So the brewery would buy a lot and they would turn it into a bar. And then a man would come and rent the bar from them and have to carry their beer in the bar to sell. And that's how the beer industry worked up until Prohibition. And it was after Prohibition that they changed the laws and did not allow the breweries to control the entire vertical portion of the system.
yeah, it's a system. You see this, you hear about it. It's still, to some extent, it's still true in places like Britain, where they call them tied houses. The bar was tied to the brewery, and I've seen that term used historically in Syracuse. That there were some breweries that had tied houses as their outlets.
And I know that was a part of the post-prohibition laws was to break the
Yeah,
tide system, right? So
yeah.
back to these consuming beer. So you got these pails of beer coming out, but if I was sitting down in a bar, or even if I were at home, what did I drink out of? Did they have glassware then? Did they have tin cups? I mean, do you know how people were?
If you were drinking at home, somebody just brought home a pail from the local bar. That's really how it was. There, there growlers as we know them today were not invented up until just after World War II. It was mostly a pail of beer, and then what happens is that during Prohibition, many breweries who didn't go out of business were just struggling making malt extract and a number of other products, and they learned how to package in beer in cans, and they discovered that it was just as good to sell beer in a can because the two major can corporations finally figured out how to line tin so that the beer wouldn't beer and tin don't interact well. There's a chemical reaction, and so what you had to do was create a beer can that was coated on the inside that would allow the beer to retain its freshness. And once that happened, they could sell it in grocery stores, and the breweries were much happier selling beer in grocery stores. And they realized that the can, which was lighter than a bottle, for example, because you could still buy bottles, but bottles were made of bottles came in and out of fashion, um, and were not as prevalent as we sometimes think. And the beer can makes a big difference in terms of selling in the grocery store. And so after Prohibition, they really concentrate on selling in the grocery store, whether it's bottles or cans, depending on what that particular brewery's style was, and that's when the breweries, that when the law changes after Prohibition, uh, th- that's where you start bringing beer home. Otherwise, before the war, and ever before that, was always a pail of beer, and you poured it into a glass or you drank it out of the buckets, whatever you did.
Right. I want to spin off from that too. Is that the what we talked about earlier, the lightening up of the color of beer. My understanding, and I've read this a lot in a lot of different places. Back in the day, you might have had stoneware mugs that you were drinking out of. A lot of places, in some fashion of Stein stoneware. As beer got lighter and clearer over the course of the 1800s, and then certainly into the 20th century, to consume it, you wanted to look at it, and so that led to more and more clear glasses that were being used as you went on. And you can see this, and I have a lot of examples of the old ads from the 1800s, early 1900s, where the ad has the drinker holding up his nice glass of beer and looking at that beautiful golden color. Well, if you were drinking out of a stoneware, a Stein or a stoneware, you wouldn't be able to see that color. So the drinking out of glass, I believe, is definitely tied to the lightening up of the color of beer over time.
Don, you are spot on. The Pilsner glass is not a particularly great glass to drink out of, but it was exactly designed to show off the fact that it was light in color and that it was clear and clean and refreshing, and that
And
it
you can
was
see the
more like
bubbles.
wine than drinking something else.
So I have to blame glasses on why we don't have these good dark beers anymore.
Or well, what about hazy? What about hazies? You couldn't be able to tell a beer is hazy if it was in a stoneware.
It's true.
Right.
You might have to blind taste and decide on your taste bud. But we'll take a short break. We'll be back in a few minutes on Beer Sessions Radio.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. Wisconsin, the state of cheese, makes half of the nation's specialty cheese and wins more awards than any other state or country. Our heritage and traditions, master cheesemaker program, and the American propensity for innovation all put Wisconsin on the cutting wedge of cheesemaking. With over 600 varieties of cheese to choose from and 5,500 national and international awards and counting, get ready to turn your refrigerator into a trophy case. Enjoying a Wisconsin cheese is basically like winning a gold medal in culinary achievement. Set your mind at cheese. When you bite into a wedge of Wisconsin Wonderful, you know it is made with the ultimate skill and passion possible. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
Hey, welcome back to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host. We're talking about the book that will come out some point next year called Empire Beer Book. And support us, become a member at heritageradionetwork.org. So, Dawn, tell us again your name and what you write, because I want to know about you as a writer. You've been studying writing beer for 30 years.
Yeah, my name is Don Kazant. I've been working up here in upstate New York. I'm originally from New Orleans, but I've been living up here for almost 40 years. I was a reporter for the local newspaper, the Post Standard. About 30 years ago, it's interesting. It's about 30 years ago.
And you're in Syracuse.
In Syracuse, yep. We had because of the Finger Lakes and the wineries, we had a person doing a wine column, and this was around 1995, and I said to the editors, I said, well, why do we have a wine column and not a beer column? And they said, well, who wants to read a beer column? I said, hey, you don't realize, but beer's coming up. Beer's getting big. And so 30 years ago, I was given a beer column to write once a month. And from that, to make a long story short, I kind of parlayed that from, I used to be covering politics and government and crime, and since that day when I said, hey, let's do a beer column, I've been able to spend more and more of my time writing about things like beer and wine and spirits and whiskey and all that kind of stuff.
Don's a very modest guy. He worked with Lou Bryson, and he wrote the book of New York breweries, and they did two editions of that. So,
Right.
and he's also written several cocktail books as well. So,
Yeah.
Don's a very modest guy. He was invaluable in writing this project.
And just so you know, I've since branched out my new thing in the last 4 years. I'm now our chief cannabis and marijuana writer for
Oh,
my
sure. I don't get
publication. So,
invited to those tastings.
Well, high times. Why not? Dawn, so just back to you. So tell me about a story that you wrote maybe recently or in the early days, one of your monthly beer columns. What was a good story that you remember?
well, it started as a monthly beer column, then it became more regular. I'm going to say I'm going to mention a story that I wrote 5 or 6 years ago, um, and the headline was "Remember the Beer Ball? It was once the life of every party." I did a story on if you remember. Do you remember the beer ball?
No, I don't.
Uh,
Oh,
okay,
absolutely. Absolutely.
if you if you lived in upstate New York, you would know it was a plastic ball, a little bit bigger than a basketball. It was used in lieu of a keg, and it was originated by FX Matt Brewing in Utica, known for Utica Club and then later Saranac beers. It was a fad. They were lightweight, portable, and if you had when I moved up here in the mid 1980s, if you went to a party, there was definitely going to be at least one, if not 6 or 7 beer balls on hand,
Absolutely.
in lieu of a keg. And these things you'd stand around. Now the great thing about them, they were really wonky. You had to. There was a special tap that went with them. The tap didn't usually work, and so the classic way at a beer ball party was to take out. Somebody had a pocket knife, take it out. You start jabbing at the beer ball until something starts coming out of it, and then you had to drink it
Yeah,
really
I was going to say,
fast.
then you had to shoot the beer ball.
Anyway, I wrote a story, Jimmy, about that a couple of years ago, and we have a way on our system of measuring the page views of our stories. I can go back and look. There is not a single day in the last 5 years that story is not getting 100 plus something page
Fascinating.
views. It's
Fascinating.
still
Fascinating. Actually, if I may, Jimmy, the thing that I would really love to do to tie it back into our original conversation is that, and Don covered this extensively, is that in 2014, New York State came up with a new law allowing for a brewery. Farm brewery license, and you had to have at least a certain portion of your beer had to be made from local ingredients. And as the law aged, you had to have more and more local product in your beer to the point where it became almost 100% local. This was an attempt to, like the wine industry in the state, to create an agritourism business to energize agricultural growth and marry it to the beer business. The only problem is that we had moved the supply chain so far out that nobody had grown hops or barley in the state for more than 100 years. And Don covered that beautifully through the whole process. And I'm wondering, Don, if you could just give us some highlights of why that was. I think it had a lot of good intentions, but the road was paved to hell when it came to trying to pull it off.
yeah. I mean, there was two parts to it. You kind of touched on it. One was to grow the agricultural part of beer, growing barley and hops. But the other part of it, the one that really did have a better impact, is that they were sort of giving out benefits originally to the breweries that pledged to do this, and that would include for the first time. When I started covering craft breweries, you could go in and get a growler and get beer to go, but you couldn't stand at the bar at the tap room, believe it or not, 30 years ago, and buy a beer and drink it at the counter. One of the tie-ins to this farm brewery law was if you were using X, Y, or Z proportion local, you'd get the benefit of being able to sell a pint at your your place, which is the invention of the brewery tap room in New York. Now, then eventually they let everybody do that, but it was sort of the intention, as Carlos said, was to promote the agriculture, which it did to some extent. But what it really did, the most important thing I think it did was kickstart the other ways that breweries began to operate. They weren't just packaging beer to be sold somewhere. They were becoming destinations. I think that was the origin of the brewery tap room. Go to it as a destination, hang out with your friends, try all the beers. You can get the growlers, you can get the crowlers, you can do all that kind of stuff. But having the brewery be the taproom destination, I think, was really kickstarted, maybe inadvertently, by this move to try to make it a agricultural thing.
It definitely changed the way people gathered, for sure. I remember, before that, 2010 even, going to a place like Brooklyn Brewery, and there were ways you had to buy a token to get a small pour of beer.
Yeah.
But then that was also when there were the great beer bars, because that's where
well, that's right.
you could buy beer. So, yeah.
One thing we haven't talked about in transportation, too, and it is a little bit of relationship, again, back with Carlos talking about the changing of the laws. We haven't really mentioned distribution. When microbreweries, which is what they were called, started back in the 80s and 90s, distribution was painful. If you had a distributor who sold Miller or sold Bud, they didn't want this stuff. What were they going to do with it? And you had this time where there was actually a time in New York anyway where a distributor could sign up a microbrewer, but it was a one-way street, because a distributor could say to the microbrewer, okay, I'll take your product, but when I don't want it anymore, you're done, I'll kick you out. But if the brewer signed with a distributor and the distributor wasn't working well for him, he couldn't get out of the contract. It was a one-way contract. And I think that's a pivotal thing too, that one of the other things that New York State did around that time, I'm going to say 2012, 2013, I don't remember exactly, they changed that so that it wasn't a one-way deal. The brewer could get out of the contract just as much as the distributor could, because because what could happen, and what was happening, is that a distributor would sign up a up-and-coming brewery and then sit on the product and not do anything with it, and could essentially kill that brewery if they wanted to. So that definitely needed to be changed, and that was also changed around that time.
Yeah, we talked to Steve Hindy about it about 10 years ago, and or 8 years ago, and he also said what the way it worked is a distributor could sign up a trendy brewery and use the logo and the advertising or the buzz from that brewery, and then push towards other products that they had as well. So yeah, it's tough. I'm gonna Carlo, I want to ask you a question, because I know it's a book. So when you have a book, you have a launch. If you were listening to me, you would pick a historic beer style from New York, and some brewery would make it for your launch. So if we go way back in time, we don't have to go back to the 1600s, but let's say in the 19th century sometime. And I want you both to think of a beer style. You don't necessarily have to know the brewery, but a beer style that was being made then that you would like to see a brewery make for your launch party. Wow. Conjecture.
Well, I think Craig would definitely say either Albany, what's his
Albany Ale,
Albany Ale, or a Matthew Vassar. I think I could speak for Craig and or Alan and say that I think those guys would probably go in that direction. Don, how about you?
Well, I'm gonna jump ahead to the 20th century, because I love craft beer. We all love all these different beer styles, IPAs, but even now, if you say upstate New York and a beer style, the one that many people are going to jump to immediately is cream ale.
Right. Good point.
And it's not a craft beer necessarily, although some craft brewers are trying to make it. And that's interesting too. So you have had, Genesee Cream Ale is possibly the most famous single beer made in upstate New York anyway. It is interesting that you will find brewers today still trying to say, well, let's see if we can make a good cream ale. And then I know also Carlos mentioned Craig a few times. Craig will be the first one to jump in and say, you know, what they were calling cream ale back in the day is not what they're calling cream ale today. So
Right,
Okay,
right.
what were they calling it then, and what's different about how you make it?
well, you know, the Genesee model, which was from 1960, I think,
Yeah, around there.
it was really using ale yeast, and then using lager temperatures and timing. Uh, so it was a hybrid ale lager. There were things called cream ale back in the 1890s, and I wish Craig was on this because he knows a lot more about it. But it was a light golden ale. I don't think there was really any lager component to that beer, whereas the Genesee style was lagered and cold stored and stuff like that. So it really the Genesee cream ale style is a hybrid, whereas the old style cream ale was not as much. I think the gold style cream ale was what we might today call a light golden ale. I think.
Do you think it might have been a Kolsch? Because Kolsch is ale that's uh, fermented like a lager, isn't it?
Yeah, well, not back in the day. I'm talking about some of the breweries were making something called a cream ale in the 1880s,
Right.
1890s. That would certainly not have been lagered cold, but and really uh, you know. I think if you know a lot about beer, Jimmy. The different people in different parts of the world are doing the same thing without the other not knowing that they're doing that across the pond too. Uh, But yeah, the interesting thing you talk about Kolsch versus cream ale, there's a similarity there. But the story with Genesee cream ale, of course, is that they were making an ale. They had an ale called 12 Horse Ale. They were making lagers, and they just took the ale from one thing and the process for the other, and married them together, and that's how they got cream ale. And what I'm saying is, as your original question on the launch, to me. Having been in upstate New York for 40 years, probably the one style most associated to me with upstate New York is cream ale, no matter whatever style that is.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great point. I think if I were going to pick one, I'm thinking more of the producer than I am of the style, I guess, because in Manhattan at the in the late 1800s, I guess the two biggest ones that really made it into the turn of the century were Errett, the Hellgate Brewery, and Rupert's, and they both made whatever one made, the other made. They would literally advertise side by side. The owners, even though they were in absolute competition, were also best of friends. It was one of the most unique industrial relationships ever that I can find. There's a whole chapter in the book on it because it's just so phenomenal. I mean, they were literally across the street from each other. Each were about 6 blocks big, and two of the biggest brewers in America. And yet the owners were best friends. And so I guess either their ale or they also made a Bock, and they advertised it. And I've always wondered what that Bock must taste like. But I guess the other thing to me would be I'm a real loser when it comes to this stuff. Schaefer, I would love to have tasted a Schaefer today, and that was mostly a Vienna lager. So there are some good Vienna lagers out there, but it'd be fun to see somebody make one like they did.
So when's the book coming out?
Oh my God. Your guess is as good as mine. My goal is to finish the last edit before the end of the year. I'm hoping by summer, so that we can get it off to a publisher.
Great. All right. Before we close out, was there anything you wanted to talk about, Carlo?
Yeah, I think if there's any last thing I would say is that I'm always fascinated by the fact that you know, the with the finishing of the second aqueduct, that's when it all kind of gels. You have a massive ice harvest from the Hudson Valley. You have railroads that can deliver, thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of grain and hops very quickly down into the city. And you have six of the largest breweries in America operating. You have Lion, you have Errett, you have Rupert, and then the second team, which would go on to become massive industrial brewers, were Peels, Schaefer, and Rheingold. And it was really fascinating because it takes a confluence of things. It takes innovation in terms of refrigeration because they're all going to be making Pilsner style beers, and they graduate from ales to Pilsner over time, and and they create these anywhere from 2 to 6 block campuses that are not seen. And New York dominated the brewing industry for more than 100 years. And even after we lost all our major breweries, certainly in the city, by 1976, when Schaefer and Rheingold and Peels were finally closed, and what you ended up having was because of craft brewing, we've had a rebirth, and New York is now number 2 in the nation for brewing, just behind California. So it's a really fascinating story, and there's just so many layers to it that are just fascinating.
Well, it's great. And, Carlo and Don, thanks for joining me on Beer Sessions Radio.
Well, thank you for having
Big
us.
shout out to our engineer, Sam. Thanks for listening to us on Heritage Radio Network. We'll catch you next time. A lot more stories to learn from with the Empire Beer Book. Thanks so much, guys.